Tonight's brought to you by WACA, which is Whistleblowers, Activists and Citizens Alliance. My name's Jacob, I'm from Renegade Activists, and I'm going to be chairing tonight. To start with, I need to recognise we are talking about war and the environment here, and it would be remiss if the first issue we didn't raise was the war on the Indigenous people of this country, what we're starting to be known as the Frontiers War. And we acknowledge the people who fought in those wars and who died in those wars, and their ancestors and their descendants through to this day. And particularly here at RMIT, where just across the road in Bowen Place, we're striving to erect at the moment statues and memorials for Indigenous freedom fighters Tunaminawait and Morboy Hinai, who are buried just across the road under what is a university of learning, yet somehow no one knows about it. So, to all Indigenous people of Melbourne, past and present, we acknowledge that we are standing on stolen land that's never been ceded. And I dare say Robbie Thorpe from First Nations Liberation will be able to tell us something more about that in due course. Without further ado, I want you to put your hands together to a man who's got his third trip to Australia, who's become, as part of the Melbourne peace community, activist community, who joined us a couple of weeks ago on our world record setting drive of 2090 protests. Put your hands together for Vincent Emanuele.
Start by talking about militarism. The United States has consistently provoked Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the most important points to make is that NATO continued to expand in the post-Soviet era, despite agreements negotiated by the West, which is now designing new bases, incorporating more countries into the NATO umbrella, and consciously surrounding Russia with ballistic missile systems, attack aircraft, naval vessels, and units. Remember, the official rationale for maintaining NATO was explicitly to protect Western European nations from possible Soviet imperial expansion. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, it became clear that the US could no longer hide behind the containment policy first articulated by George Kennan in 1947, but rather that it would have to re-articulate the foreign policy aspirations in a post-Cold War era. The result has been the so-called global war on terror. Unfortunately, what we've seen is what that world looks like: drones, occupations, torture, spying, and further militarization. Political writer Pepe Escobar notes in a recent Asian Times article that the US government's defense planning guidance, a document given in 1992 and supported by a good portion of the Washington establishment, most notably former National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, Dr. Brzezinski, who wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, quote, the United States' first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order that was posed by the Soviet Union. This requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate another global superpower. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia, unquote. Fortunately, you guys were left off the list. A so-called American pivot to Asia is simply a rehashing of what Pepe Escobar calls Cold War 2.0. Indeed, the United States intends to remain the hegemon in the Southeast Asia and Asian Pacific regions at all costs. These seeds, in some ways, were planted back in 1823 when President Monroe articulated and executed his foreign policy doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine. Decades later, the seeds took root during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Noam Chomsky mentions that, quote, the current Ukrainian crisis is serious and threatening, so much so that some commentators even compare it to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, unquote. Chomsky goes on to point out the hypocrisy inherent to the arguments made by the American political leaders and media commentators, particularly the notion that the US doesn't cross international red lines when invading and occupying Iraq, torturing people in Guantanamo Bay, or overthrowing democratically elected governments. But when Russia decides to intervene in Crimea, red lines have indeed been crossed. One can only imagine what America would do if Russia helped overthrow the Canadian or Mexican government, while simultaneously surrounding the US with missile systems, war bombs, and more ships. Obama's Asian pivot has found him stumping in Malaysia and in the Philippines, promoting the Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the TPP, or NAFTA on steroids. However, the TPP includes a military component, specifically a more robust troop presence in the Southern Pacific. As Al Jazeera reports, quote, the United States and the Philippines have reached a 10-year agreement that would allow a larger US military presence in the Southeast Asian country as it grapples with increasingly tense territorial disputes with China. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement allows for US troops to be deployed on a temporary and rotational basis, essentially a highly capable joint force command to further contain China. Let's shift to Latin America, particularly Venezuela, a constant thorn in the side of American policymakers, notably in the Chavez and post-Chavez era. Of course, mainstream Western media reports would have us believe that the protesters in Venezuela are legitimate and fighting for a good cause. Fortunately, others are more honest and take their profession seriously. In a Counterpunch article, Eva Gullinger reports that between 2013 and 2014, over $14 million has been funneled to government opposition groups in Venezuela, vis-a-vis the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Agency for International Development, two of the main economic civilian components of the military-industrial complex in the United States. Moreover, let's remember that these two organizations also played a key role in attempting to overthrow Chavez back in 2002. Fortunately, Venezuelan military commanders and citizens demanded justice for Chavez in Venezuela and the democratic process and rejected the US coup d'etat back in 2002. In Africa, which is quickly becoming the new hot zone for US military operations, especially aimed at possible Chinese and Russian alliances on the continent, the US empire is expanding its power, of course causing devastating results for the people of that continent. Military historian and international journalist Nick Turse recently wrote in a Huffington Post article, quote, last year, according to AFRICOM commander, US General David Rodriguez, the US military carried out a total of 546 missions on the continent, a catch-all term for everything the military does in Africa. In other words, the US military averages about 1.5 missions per day in Africa and has since 2008. This represents a 217% increase in operations, programs, and exercises commanded in Africa since 2008. As Turse goes on to mention, these exercises include, quote, airstrikes targeting suspected militants, night raids aimed at kidnapping terror suspects, airlifts of French and African troops onto the battlefield of proxy wars, and evacuation operations in destabilized countries. Above all, however, the US military conducts training missions, mentors allies, funds, equips, and advises its local surrogates and warlords, unquote. As always, the US has allies and partners interested in continuing the presence, hence the 18 nations who will be assisting the US AFRICOM Command in future military exercises and operations. Some of these nations include the UK, France, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Germany, among many others. Unfortunately, this brief introduction into ongoing US military operations simply scratches the surface of what the US military is doing right now. As the global underclass understands, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestine, and others throughout the Middle East who have felt the absolute wrath of US military force and for many decades. As Henry Kissinger once said, quote, America doesn't have friends, America only has interests. The people of the global south or the third world who've endured Uncle Sam for over 2 centuries. The results are well known. Millions dead, millions injured, millions displaced, and a ravaged and toxic natural environment affecting millions for decades to come. For many in the world, Recent developments are simply old policies, repackaged and rebranded for the 21st century. In short, none of this should be too surprising. Sure, the scope and the mechanisms have changed, which I'll talk about soon, but the overall aim, ideology, and outcomes remain the same. Australia has its own problems surrounding American imperial policy and militarism. The former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Fraser, mentions in an ABC interview, quote, "The great danger is the use to which Pine Gap is now put," unquote. Further, he states, initially Pine Gap was collecting information. It was, if you like, listening in. It's now targeting weapon systems. It's also very much involved in the targeting of drones. The purposes for which drones are being used are going to be outlawed at some point through international agreement, unquote. While Americans might think they're covered by the War Powers Resolution passed after 9/11, Australians complicit in America's drone strikes are left completely vulnerable to court decisions and consequences, not to mention possible blowback in the form of domestic terrorist attacks and so forth. Another report from the ABC mentions that 3 times as many Australian veterans have killed themselves or committed suicide as died in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 14 years. In the US, over 24 veterans commit suicide every single day. Recently, the Abbott administration purchased $24 billion in military gear. This amount of money could either purchase 58 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters or 100,000 new housing units, 1,000 new metro trains, or 11 state-of-the-art hospitals with 800 new beds in each. Despite the adverse human and environmental consequences of increased global militarization, many entities benefit handedly from the US imperial system. Where does one begin? We have banks, energy companies, corporations, etc. But in keeping with the militarism theme of the evening, let's namely focus on arms manufacturers. In an article published 2 weeks ago, Time magazine journalists Vince Callow and Alexander E.M. Hess listed the top 5 companies making a killing from increased militarism. They note that, quote, despite a decline in military spending, the business of war remains a good one. The 100 largest arms producers and military service contractors recorded $395 billion in arms sales in the year 2012. The largest of these contractors, Lockheed Martin, reported $36 billion in sales. The second largest, Boeing, reported $27.6 billion in sales, while Raytheon, BAE Systems, and General Dynamics round out the top 5, all reporting tens of billions of dollars in arms sales worldwide. Interestingly, the top 5 arms-dealing nations in the world, the US, UK, Germany, China, and Russia, include 4 of the permanent 5 members currently sitting on the UN Security Council, with the exception, of course, of Germany. Let's be clear, the West is not the only region to increase militarization. As Sneha Shankar writes in the International Business Times Online, quote, India imported more than twice as many weapons in the last 5 years than it did in the previous 5-year span ending in 2008, making it the world's largest buyer of arms. Additionally, as Shankar notes, Russia, which reached an initial agreement last month with Egypt for a $2 billion arms deal, accounted for 75% of the arms supplied to to India, while the US supplied a merely 7%. China, being the second largest importer of arms currently, has also become a major supplier in South Asia, accounting for 54% of Pakistan's arms imports and 82% of the imports in Bangladesh. In the last 5 years, Australia's arms imports have increased by 83%. Again, as we can clearly determine, weapon sales are big business. Additionally, we must view these developments through the scope of the state. Hence, we should not be surprised when state apparatuses aim to expand their power and further militarize. This, of course, is inherent to the state's DNA. Moving along, I'd like to discuss present and future military weaponry and technology, which, of course, will have a profound impact on the work that people do in this room, how we view our lives, and how wars are fought in the future. Possibly the most important institution with regard to future militarization is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA began as an advanced research projects agency, which was initially created in 1958 under Dwight D. Eisenhower. DARPA's original mission was to prevent technological launches such as the Sputnik, which signaled that the Soviets had beaten the US into space. Today, DARPA's mission is still to maintain America's military technological superiority at all costs. DARPA has been responsible for funding the development of many technologies which have had a major effect on the world today, including the stealth bomber, computer networking, as well as NLS, which was both the first hypertext system and an important precursor to the contemporary ubiquitous graphical user interface. So in other words, many credit DARPA with also creating the internet. This brings us to the fighting machines of today, most notably the Predator unmanned aerial vehicle, drones. About the size of a school bus, the Predator is a very complex machine linked to a command center with a soldier operating the aircraft via joystick. Some people operate these commands from places like Nevada, while utilizing several satellites in the Earth's orbit to conduct coordinates and so forth. So according to Pete Singer, a senior research fellow at the Brookings Institute, the first Predator drones were used back in 1995 during the Balkans conflicts in Bosnia and Kosovo. By 2000, the Air Force was developing ways to weaponize the Predator drones as they were previously exclusively used in spy missions. Recently, when we started the war back in 2003 in Iraq, there were a handful of drones in Iraqi airspace. Currently, there are over 5,300 drones operating in Iraq's airspace. Additionally, we went into Iraq with 0 unmanned ground robotic systems. We now have 12,000 operating in the combat zone. To be clear, in a typical attack, a Predator drone is soaring at 5,000 feet, firing at an enemy target 1 mile away, while destroying that target in less than 4 seconds. As Singer mentions, there are now over 30 nations worldwide who are developing drone technology. Much like the nuclear weapon, this has now started an arms race that will continue on to the next century. Much like the advent of nuclear weapons, advancements in robotics technology will start a trend that cannot be stopped. Yet unlike nuclear weapons, which are now the how of fighting wars, military robotics technology will determine who is fighting these wars. DARPA has enlisted the help of robotics firm Berkeley Bionics to re-engineer the human foot soldier, giving human foot soldiers superhuman strength. The result is the Hulk, the Human Universal Load Carrier, which is a robotic exoskeleton that soldiers step into. It's essentially a wearable robot. It takes a load usually carried by 4 or 5 infantry troops and distributes it throughout the exoskeleton. For those who've seen James Cameron's Avatar, you know what that looks like. The machines that the people who are fighting the avatars are wearing, most notably the privatized United States Marine Corps, which was a corporation in the film, which I thought was brilliant. Those machines, James Cameron got his idea from DARPA. He also got a lot of his ideas from the first Terminator films from DARPA, mentioning that when he went to film the first Terminator film in 1991, DARPA had already been working on anything that him and his team had thought of, and much more. The result, of course, is this machine mimics the movements of people who are wearing it. 4 sensors read the onset of these movements. Then these readings are fed into a computer several thousand times per second before the pilot of the exoskeleton exerts any force. This is what the military calls a force multiplier. Most notably, the ultimate goal of military scientists is full autonomy, robots that make their own decisions. In some ways, this is an extension of the Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution, and the autonomous robotics developments taking place right now at universities such as RMIT. Advancements in Japanese non-military droids give us a glimpse of robots developing the brainpower needed to engage in autonomous battlefield operations. The Japanese computer firm Fujitsu has recently developed a robot called Hope, which are able to learn movements the same way humans do. Hope is a tool to help researchers in studying artificial intelligence and software for future robots. This process allows robots to learn in the same fashion as human babies. A huge portion of AI research is the attempt to duplicate the process of learning. This is what DARPA is working on right now. So at what point do we give the ability to make a kill decision to a machine? Recently, there was a study prepared by the U.S. Joint Forces Command which suggested that by 2025, the U.S. military will have the technology to develop autonomous battlefield robots. 5 days ago, a group of leading scientists, including Stephen Hawking, Stuart Russell, and many others, penned an article in the UK Independent entitled "Transcendence Looks at the Implications of Artificial Intelligence, but Are We Taking Artificial Intelligence Seriously Enough?" They mention that the potential benefits from AI could be stellar advancements in the history of human civilization. However, Stephen Hawking notes that such benefits could be humanity's last greatest achievement. Quote, "In the near term, world militaries are considering autonomous weapon systems that can choose and eliminate targets on their own. The UN and Human Rights Watch have advocated a treaty banning such weapons. In the medium term, as emphasized by Eric Brzezinski and Andrew McAfee in The Second Machine Age, artificial intelligence may transform our economy and bring both great wealth and great dislocation." Hawking continued, quote, "One can imagine such technology outsmarting financial markets, out-inventing human researchers, out-manipulating human leaders, and developing weapons we cannot even begin to understand. Whereas the short-term impact of artificial intelligence depends on who controls it, the long-term impact depends on whether it can be controlled at all." For me, the systemic problems surrounding the environment and militarism begin with a very sort of subjective acceptance that human beings are the most important, celebrated, and cherished creatures on the planet Earth. I beg to differ. Nonetheless, let's try and broaden the scope of our environmental critique beyond the usual criticisms of capitalism and/or industrial civilization. Ecological poet and author, activist Derek Jensen makes a very prescient point with regard to how the environment is threatened and interpreted within the context of Western civilization. If the Epic of Gilgamesh is the founding tale upon which Western cultural values reside, then what does this mean for the natural environment? The epic Sumerian tale of Gilgamesh describes vast tracts of cedar forest in what is now southern Iraq. According to the mythical story, Gilgamesh defies the gods by cutting down the forest, and in turn the gods say they will curse the land with fire and drought. In fact, the Sumerians deforested the land, of course not the gods, causing widespread desertification and ecological carnage. By 2100 BC, soil erosion and salt buildup have devastated agriculture, forcing residents to move north to Babylonia and Assyria. Unsurprisingly, some of the first laws ever written to protect forests were decreed in the Sumerian settlement of Ur. This is the tale of empire. It's a tale of centralized institutions, ideological lunacy, and philosophical madness. It's a tale of greed. It's a tale of loss and heartache. It's a tale of resource extraction. It's tales filled with racism, sexism, patriarchy, and discrimination. It's a tale of slavery. In the modern capitalist context, it's the tale of complete and utter commodification of the living world. Everything can be bought and sold on a market. Sex, human bodies, organs, plants, animals, water, and the air we breathe. It's all for sale, and it has been for 5,000 years. In an article published last year in the peer-reviewed journal Proceedings of the Royal Society, Australian biologists Paul and Anne Elric point out, quote, "Virtually every past civilization has eventually undergone collapse, a loss of socio-political economic complexity usually accompanied by a dramatic decline in population size. Some, such as the civilizations in Egypt and China, have recovered from collapses at various stages. Others, such as that in the Easter Island or the classic Maya, were apparently permanent. All those previous collapses were local or regional. Elsewhere, other societies and civilizations persisted unaffected. Sometimes, as in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, new civilizations rode in succession. In many, if not most cases, overexploitation of the environment was one or the ultimate cause of civilization collapse. But today, for the first time in the history of human civilization, the worldwide, increasingly interconnected, highly technological society in which we are all to one degree or another embedded in today is threatened with a collapse by an array of environmental problems. In real time, the consequences of environmental exploitation are playing out in catastrophic fashion. Peter Moskowitz from Al Jazeera English writes that a recent report concerning environmental damage, which was sanctioned by the Obama White House, illustrates a dire picture for humanity's future. Quote, scientists believe the window for action on climate change is rapidly closing. Experts have warned for years that without drastic actions, the world's ecosystems will dramatically change and have been changing, with drought, extreme weather, food shortages, and increased public health problems becoming the new norm. Or, in a more grim manner, as CBS News in the US recently reported, quote, the apocalypse has a new date, 2048. That's when the world's oceans will be empty of fish, predicts an international team of ecologists and economists. The cause? The disappearance of species due to overfishing, pollution, habitat loss, and climate change, unquote. In other words, it's not just climate change that threatens our existence, but also species extinction, loss of biodiversity, and so on. Yesterday, the New York Times reported that, quote, after the Deepwater Horizon oil rig blew in Gulf of Mexico, some 50 miles from the nearest land, responders were left to cope with a research area of nearly 40,000 square miles, as well as wind and currents that kept evidence from damage away from the easily seeable coastline. Patrollers discovered fewer than 3,000 dead birds because of the oil collapse. Now, a team of scientists has tried to quantify the extent of the damage done during the oil rig explosion and are estimating that there are close to 800,000 to 1 million birds who died in the coastal and offshore waters just due to the oil rig explosion. So what are the current connections between militarism and climate change? Journalist and author Christian Parenti recently penned a book that I think everyone in this room who's serious about understanding these topics should check out. Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change, and the New Geography of Violence. Christian's fundamental premise is that within the context of climate change, new areas around the globe will become more violent, and areas that are historically violent will become even more so as this process accelerates. The catastrophic convergence, as he calls it, is the combination of neoliberal economic policies, leftover cheap weapons such as AK-47s, RPGs, cluster munitions, and so forth from the Cold War, in the overarching context of ecological devastation. Conflict zones such as Afghanistan and Syria provide prime examples of how this process plays out. For example, in Syria, from 2006 to 2011, most regions throughout the country experienced at least a 60% total crop failure. In the northeast region of Syria, farmers reported almost complete crop failure and the loss of over 85% of their livestock, affecting over 1.3 million people. Some estimate that if current rates continue, greenhouse gas emissions continue, from 2010 to 2050, yields of rain-fed crops would decline by 57% just in Syria alone. Couple these trends with leftover weapons from the Cold War, in other words, cheap access to small arms, and we can see why armed struggle has taken place in Syria, not to mention the meddling of outside superpower, namely the United States. Much like Afghanistan, where farmers are growing poppy instead of growing other crops, one, because of the high financial rates of return, but also because Afghanistan, just like Syria, is going through the worst drought in recorded history. Hence, it makes sense to grow poppy, as it takes 1/5 the amount of water to grow poppy as it does other plants and other crops in Afghanistan. Western leaders encourage and more often than not force such nations into liberalized economies, opening themselves to foreign investment and vampire capitalists, only furthering the misery of an already ravaged nation. Afghanistan, of course, provides a prime example, as the United States wanted to make Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam. We see what the results have been. So to conclude, we are, as my friend Chip Henris constantly points out, and as Chris Hedges rightly mentions, chasing our very own Moby Dick, sailing in the Pequod with our lunatic Captain Ahab steering the boat, chasing phantasmal dreams of riches and cultural mythologies like technological prowess and so-called progress. The overarching drive for so-called human progress and economic growth is destroying our lives and is no longer compatible with the living world. The urge to chase the dreams of progress have led previous civilizations into what Canadian anthropologist Ronald Wright calls progress traps. The problems we face today are immense in nature, thus why I think we should resist simplistic temptations to come up with very easy answers when addressing very complex social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental problems. In some ways, the equation is quite simple. People must get involved, stay engaged, and question how willing they are to sacrifice for this movement. Serious political activism will include verbal abuse, surveillance, beatings, jail time, torture, and possibly death. Or, as previously mentioned, humanity and the planet face the prospect of total annihilation, as almost every biological scientist, environmental scientist, political analyst is now mentioning. So where's the hope? With this in mind, and to finish my talk this evening, I once again turn to a friend of mine, Derek Jensen, for a thoughtful reminder about the concept of hope. I'll take a drink before I start.
Done well.
Quote, "A wonderful thing happens when you give up on hope, which is that you realize you never needed it in the first place. You realize that giving up on hope didn't kill you. It didn't even make you less effective. In fact, it made you more effective, because you ceased relying on someone or something else to solve your problems. You ceased hoping your problems would somehow get solved through the magical assistance of God, the Great Mother, the Sierra Club, valiant tree sitters, brave salmon, or even the earth itself. And you just begin doing whatever it takes to solve the problems yourself. When you give up on hope, something even better happens than it not killing you, which is that in some sense, it does kill you. You die. And there's a wonderful thing about being dead, which is that those in power, cannot really touch you anymore. Not through promises, not through violent threats, not through violence itself. Once you're dead in this way, you can still sing, you can still dance, and you can still make love. You can still fight like hell, and you can still live because you are still alive. More alive, in fact, than you've ever been before. You come to realize that when hope died, the you who died with the hope was not you, but was the you who depended on those who exploit you. The you who believed that those who exploit you will somehow stop on their own accord. The you who believed in mythologies propagated by those who exploit you in order to facilitate more exploitation. The socially constructed you died. The civilized you died. The manufactured, fabricated, stamped, and molded you died. The victim dead. And who is left that after you who dies? You are left. Animal you, naked you, vulnerable and invulnerable you, moral you, survivor you. The you who thinks not what the culture taught you to think, but what you think. The you who feels not what the culture taught you to feel, but what you feel. The you who is not who the culture taught you to be, but who you are. The you who can say yes, the you who can say no. The you who is part of the land where you live, the you who will fight, or not, to defend your family. The you who will fight, or not, to defend those you love. The you whose morality is not based on what you have been taught by a culture that is killing the planet, killing you, but on your own animal feelings of love and connection to your family, your friends, your land base. Not to your family as self-identified civilized beings, but as animals who require a land base. Animals who are being killed by chemicals, and animals who have been formed and deformed to fit the needs of the culture. When you give up on hope, when you are dead in this way, and by being, are really being alive, you make yourself no longer vulnerable to the co-option of rationality and fear that Nazis inflicted on Jews and others, that abusers like my father inflict on their victims or other rape victims, that the dominant culture inflicts on all of us. Or is it rather the case that these exploiters frame physical, social, and emotional circumstances such that victims perceive themselves as having no choice but to inflict this co-option on themselves? But when you give up on hope, the exploiter-victim relationship is broken. You become like the Jews who participated in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. When you give up on hope, you turn away from fear. And when you quit relying on hope and instead begin to protect the people you love, the things and places you love, you become very dangerous indeed to those in power. In case you're wondering, that's a very good thing. Thank you.